Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Zoom into Nature Oaks and Maples with Lizzie Sords and Erica Henriksen. I am Renee Baranca, the Manager of Conservation Education and Outreach at Western Reserve Land Conservancy. At the Land Conservancy, I develop nature-based programming, both virtually and in person, for people of all ages, often utilizing the expansive network of conservation properties the Land Conservancy has protected in Northeast Ohio, which totals close to 70,000 acres of natural landscapes, family farms, and urban green spaces. Tonight, we are focusing on identifying oaks and maples, two common genera in Northeast Ohio. For those of you who attended our first session, you learned the basics of tree ID. Now we'll dive deeper into identifying oaks and maples down to species. During tonight's presentation, please place your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. It is my pleasure to introduce Lizzie Sords and Erica Henriksen. Lizzie is a TREC certified arborist. TREC stands for Tree Risk Assessment Qualification. It is a program from the International Society of Arboriculture that recognizes that Lizzie has specialized knowledge in tree risk assessment. She has been with the Land Conservancy since October of 2019 and leads our Reforest Our City initiative, which we launched in 2014 with the goal of reforesting Cleveland's depleted tree canopy. Through this program, we are working towards a 30% increase in Cleveland's tree canopy by 2040. We host community tree planting events, train residents in tree biology, planting and maintenance, and care for the trees we have planted. To date, Reforest Our City has planted and given away over 15,000 trees throughout Cleveland and the surrounding region. Erica Henriksen is the NOWCorps Community Forestry Specialist with the Land Conservancy. Erica graduated from Cleveland State University in May 2021 with a double major in environmental studies and promotional communications, as well as a certificate in GIS. Erica interned with the Land Conservancy's tree team in 2020 and worked with Holden Arboretum's community forestry team in 2021. Welcome, Lizzie and Erica. As we always do, we're going to get started with a couple of trivia questions. So let's launch that. Okay. At what age do oak trees begin to produce acorns?
Here's an answer from Wikipedia.org. Oak trees may start producing acorns when they are about 20 years old.
Okay, excellent. Well, some of you got the answer right, but not all of you did. The answer is 50 to 100 years old. In general, it takes over 50 years for an oak tree to start producing acorns, although some open-grown trees may produce acorns as early as 20 years. So we're got one more question. Forgot to share the results, so there you go. 1 out of 19 got the answer right, so that's interesting. Okay, we have one more question for everyone, and it is not as tough. What do we commonly call the fruit of maple trees? Samaras, helicopters, maple keys, whirlybirds, all of the above. It's clearly a trick question. It's all of the above. It's fun watching these spin towards the ground from the trees. Okay, so I'm going to let Lizzie and Erica take it away.
Thanks, Renee. So thank you everybody for joining tonight. In tonight's webinar, we will be building on foundations and topics that we discussed in last month's webinar, Foundations of Tree Identification, with a goal to start learning how to separate our common species of oak trees and maple trees. And again, my name is Lizzie and I am on tonight with Erica. So Renee gave an overview of the reforestation program, and this webinar is part of the reforestation programming. Reforestation is the Land Conservancy's program aimed at growing tree canopy in the city of Cleveland, with a mission to increase Cleveland's tree canopy by growing trees, advocating for mature trees, and engaging residents and volunteers. We do this through tree planting and maintenance. So we maintain the trees that we plant through their establishment, distributing free trees for Cleveland residents to plant in their yards, and training community members to be volunteer tree stewards. If you're interested in getting involved in the reforestation work, you can let us know by sending us an email at trees@wrlandconservancy.org to find out about volunteer and education opportunities. So tonight we are diving into advanced tree ID and talking about the identification features and differences between oaks and maples. Our goals for tonight are to provide you with tools to identify some of the most common oaks and maples that you will come across in the Northeast Ohio landscape, and to build upon existing tree ID knowledge and terminology. So in our last webinar, we talked about field guides that we like, and we do still recommend the Sibley Guide to Trees as a great resource for oaks and maples, but we also want to bring your attention to this Forest Service field guide, which, although denser than the Sibley Guide, provides a really great breakdown of species identification, especially trees that are native to Ohio forest, and really calling out very minute identification details that you can sometimes need to know if your oak tree is not setting seed or it's missing leaves, but you're intent on identifying species. I also recommend a jeweler's loupe for in the field ID to get a close-up of buds, leaf scars, leaf veins, other small features. This is a really great tool to have in your pocket. And because tree identification is best learned through repetition, practice, and experience, we are going to start tonight's webinar with an overview of some of our basic principles and begin to add on to them before we go into our species cheat sheets. So first up is leaf arrangement, talking about simple versus compound leaves. So remembering from last time that leaves can either be simple or compound, where compound leaf means having multiple leaf blades, so that flat green surface where photosynthesis is happening per leaf structure. A simple leaf has one blade. So one leaf blade per leaf is simple, multiple leaf blades per leaf is compound. An easy way to tell if your leaf is simple or compound is to trace back from the tip of the leaf back to the bud or bud scar. So I'm going to annotate on the screen where we can see this. If you just encounter one leaf blade as you are going back from tip of leaf to back here where the bud is, then you have a simple leaf. And if you start at the tip, trace your way back, and you run into multiple leaf blades, this example has 5 before you get to this bud, then you have a compound leaf. In oaks and maples, the majority of the species that we'll be going over are simple leaves, but we do have one species of maple that is common to Ohio where we will see those compound leaves. And for leaf arrangement, we can think back to our mnemonic device, Mad Buck, with M standing for maple. So maple leaves will emerge opposite from each other on a twig, such as they are in this illustration, and oak leaves will be alternate or offset on the branch, such as this example. A tree that has whorled leaf arrangement will have leaves that spiral around the branch. Tonight, we will be seeing mostly opposite and alternate. And then we also want to remember and redefine our leaf venation patterns. So the arrangement of the veins on the leaf. We have pinnate and palmate, pinnate being what oak trees display and palmate being the tendency that maple trees display. Veins that are pinnate emerge from the midrib or the central vein that runs up the middle of the leaf, reminiscent of a feather. Palmate veins emerge from a central point at the base of the leaf and radiate outwards. So I like to remember palmate like the palm of my hand and my fingers emerging from the palm of my hand to tell the two apart. And we did review a little bit of this earlier with our trivia, but we really just want to hammer it home. Oaks and maples produce different types of seeds from each other. And once you figure out what type of seed you're looking at, the visual appearance of that seed will help you narrow it down to species. So oaks produce acorns and maples produce samaras or helicopters or whirlybirds, whatever your terminology for the way they flutter down from the tree is. Samaras always have a papery wing and a papery case surrounding a seed. And acorns are a type of nut. So a nut is a fruit where there's a hard shell around a kernel. The appearance of the samara or acorn will tell you a lot about the species of the tree that you're looking at. So size, color, texture of the cap on an acorn, angle at which the two seeds are set from each other on the maple samaras, and even the season at which the tree is setting seed will tell you a lot about the type of maple or oak that you're looking at once you've identified the type of seed that the tree has. And then both oaks and maples are angiosperms, which means they flower before they set seeds. So we may not think of oaks or maples as being spectacular flowering trees, but they do both produce flowers. Oaks produce tiny flowers called catkins that hang in chains and are not super showy. You might be able to tell that they're flowering just by the sheer number of catkins from a tree, but you're not going to be stopping and oohing and awing the way that you are when a dogwood or a magnolia blooms. And in fact, most oaks are either flowering now or have just finished flowering. So maples produce a more typical flower, although it is also little, and your field guide is likely going to refer to this as a maple blossom. So although these are small, these flowers can be very vibrant, such as the red maple flowers, and they do have petals. But the size of the flowers and the nondescript appearance tells us that both of these genera of trees are mostly pollinated by wind. And our maples mostly all flowered very early in the spring, with red maple being the earliest flowering tree in our forest. And so now we're going to go a little bit more in depth into the nomenclature that you'll see in your tree guides, genus and species names, as well as some of the meaning behind these names and the clues that you can learn from them. So the first word of the scientific binomial name of the plant will tell you what genus it belongs in. So a genus being a group of trees that share overlapping characteristics, but not every single identification characteristic. Oaks belong to the genus Quercus, where a characteristic is that they tend to be large trees that produce acorns and have flowers in the form of catkins. Maples belong to the genus Acer, where definition or characteristics of that genus being that they produce samaras and they have a oppositely arranged leaf pattern. And so going into our species name, this is where you can learn a lot about the tree, including, but not limited to, features of the tree, features of the tree's habitat, human uses of the trees. It can also link back to the name of the botanist who recorded the tree for the first time, regions where the tree is found. There are many different kind of etymological backgrounds of where the species name comes from, but we're going to focus on a few scientific names that kind of fit this: features of the tree, features of the habitat or human uses of the tree pattern to break down the meaning and kind of intent behind some of our scientific names. So we'll take these two trees, red maple and bur oak, as examples where scientific names relate back to the features of the tree. So Quercus Macrocarpa being the binomial name for bur oak. We can break this down and learn a lot about our bur oak. Quercus, we know that that means it is an oak tree. Macrocarpa, breaking down into two roots for large seed. So macro meaning large, carpa meaning seed. And bur oaks produce the largest acorns out of all of our native oak trees, about the size of a golf ball, super noticeable when the seed is set. I'm going to go over here to red maple, Acer rubrum. So Acer meaning maple, rubrum is a straight translation to red. We have red maple. So red maples have vibrant red flowers, vibrant red petioles, which is the stem connecting the leaf to the twig. Their samaras are red. They have red fall color. The new leaves even have a tinge of red as they emerge. So this name is really speaking to that characteristic of the tree, which although many other maples do have a lot of red in their fall color, red maples show it the most. We'll use two other examples for features of the tree. Again, an oak and a maple. Quercus bicolor for swamp white oak. Again, Quercus meaning oak, bi meaning two, and color meaning colors. The swamp white oak has a very white underside of the leaf. So the glossy green on the top side, bright white of the bottom side, flip it over back and forth. It's a two-colored leaf. This is a characteristic of this tree. Not every oak shows this characteristic in this extreme. It's special to the swamp white oak. Then we're going to go over to a tree that, although common to Ohio, is not native and is a bit invasive, Norway maple. Scientific name Acer platanoides. Acer tells us it's a maple. Platanoides means plane tree-like or like a plane tree. So plane trees are sycamores, London planes in the genus Platanus. This Norway maple has leaves that can appear to look like a sycamore leaf, especially in their native habitat, which is Northern Europe. These look a lot like sycamore leaves, and we can see that in our scientific name. And we'll talk about trees with scientific names relating to the feature of the habitat. Quercus palustris, our pin oak. So this is an oak that likes the swamp, palustris meaning swampy. Pin oaks will tolerate swampy soil, can be found in bottomlands or close to a river in that sort of swampy habitat. And then, of course, human uses of the tree. We utilize trees for many things, and often this is reflected in how we name them, such as Shingle Oak, Quercus umbricaria, where umbricaria means overlapping. Shingle Oak was a wood used to make shingles for homes. So we've taken that use of the tree and related it right back to that scientific name. And then our sugar maple, which we all know and love here in Northeast Ohio, Acer saccharum, saccharum meaning many sugars. This is the maple tree that has the highest concentration of sugar in its sap, so it is the best tree for tapping. Although we could tap other maple trees, the ratio of sap to syrup is best with the sugar maple. And now I'm going to turn it over to Erica, who's going to take us through our identifying features of a tree that we went over last time, as well as add some new ones.
Awesome. So in the intro to Tree ID webinar that we hosted last month, we focused on the basics. So we identified trees based on their leaves, their fruit and or seeds, as well as the overall form of the tree. Today, however, if you could go to the next slide, we're going to be giving you an expansion pack of terms and features that are useful in identifying a tree. thus building on the information laid out in the previous webinar. And don't worry if you didn't attend that presentation, you'll still be able to follow along and learn. We will be reviewing some more advanced leaf terminology, such as marcescence, Tementum, and Glaucus. We will go over techniques for identifying a tree based on its twig as well as its bark. And then we'll go over terms like size class, habitat, mimicry, and phenology. So our first term that we're going to go over is marcescence. This is a phenomena where some species of trees do not shed their dead and withered leaves in the autumn. So they remain firmly affixed to the stem throughout the winter and into the spring, often not falling off until new growth starts. So tree species that have this characteristics are all oak species, American beech, American hornbeam, eastern hop hornbeam, as well as witch hazel species. So if you see a tree in the middle of winter with dead withered leaves holding on to it, you can narrow its identification down to one of these species listed on the slide. And then our next term is Tementum, which is defined as a layer of matted, woolly, or felt-like down on the surface of a plant. So this term can be used to describe buds, seed coverings, twigs, or leaves. So for example, the underside of swamp white oak leaves are very velvety and known and described as tomentous. Then our next term is Glaucus, which is defined as appearing pale gray-green or white. And this is usually due to a bloom or a waxy coating. So this term is most often used to describe a color change between two sides of a leaf. Such as in the swamp white oak, silver maple, and red silver hybrid. And twigs, and identifying trees by twigs can be helpful as they grow in a variety of shapes, colors, and sizes depending on what species they are, especially in the winter when there aren't leaves on the tree to identify with. So for example, some twigs are more stout while others are more thin. Some may be hairy while others aren't, and some have large buds while others have very tiny buds. So when you're looking at a twig, it is important to be able to identify and point out the following terms that are listed on the slide. So we have the terminal bud, which is the bud at the tip of the twig, while the lateral buds are the other buds growing along the sides of the twig. And then we have the leaf scar, which is the mark left on the stem where a leaf was previously attached. And then on the leaf scar, you can see bundle scars, which are marks left in the leaf scar from where the vascular tissue of the leaf was attached to the vascular tissue of the stem. So they look like tiny little dots. And then lastly, the terminal bud scar is the mark left on the stem from where the previous terminal bud was located. And this shows you the annual growth of this stem. And then tree bark also varies greatly throughout the life of a tree. It becomes rougher as the tree grows and matures, which can make it very hard to identify a tree by its bark because it's so variable. However, with practice, there are patterns you can identify in different species of trees. So for example, ridged bark can be characterized by channeled depressions that form regular or irregular raised ridge-like projections, as shown on the northern red oak on the slide. And then there's plated bark, which is broken up by small fissures to form regular or irregular flat plate-like units, as shown on the white oak on the screen. And then we also have papery bark, which has a smooth texture with outer bark peeling off in thin paper-like sheets, such as the beautiful paper bark maple. And then tree species can also be broken up into size class, which refers to what the expected size of a certain species is at maturity. So most, if not all, oaks can be classified into the large size class, whereas maples vary in size class across species more so. So for example, we have our small size class, which we would have our Japanese maple in, a medium size class, which would be our Norway maple, And then our large size class is what most of our oaks are in, such as our bur oak or red oak or white oak, things like that. And then identifying the environment that a tree is living in can also be very helpful in distinguishing the species of it. And depending on the habitat that it's growing in, this can be more or less helpful, as many trees do well in a very large variety of different habitats. However, in a more unique habitat, such as a swampy, wet environment, you can narrow down the species list more so. So only some species are tolerant to wet, saturated soils. So that list includes red maple, silver maple, swamp white oak, pin oak, and willow oak. So if the tree is growing in an environment that looks like the picture on the right, the soil is really wet, it's saturated with water, the tree is more likely to be a swamp white oak than, say, a red oak. Next slide. And then mimicry is defined as being a phenomena of superficial resemblance by two or more organisms, where the resemblance offers an advantage to the species. So for example, box elder, a species of maple, very closely resembles poison ivy. So we're going to launch a poll testing your poison ivy ID knowledge. So which picture shows the leaves of a maple tree and which picture shows poison ivy leaves? We'll go ahead and launch that poll.
Renee, I think we can close the poll. Thank you. I think you're the only one that has the powers to do that.
Can you see the results?
I can. Erica, can you?
I cannot.
Okay, so we had 82% of participants guessed that the left photo was showing leaves of a maple tree native to the eastern United States, and that the right photo is showing poison ivy. So we've done well in this poll.
So we don't know for sure why box elder looks similar to poison ivy or what advantages it gets from mimicking this plant. It might be so that mammals will leave the seedling alone as it grows, but we're not really sure. And then our last term for this session is phenology, which is the concept of nature's calendar. So different species flower and leaf out at different times of the year. And knowing when they do can be very helpful with tree identification. So for example, maples flower before they leaf out, and they do so very early in the spring. Whereas oaks flower and leaf out at the same time, very late in the spring, around mid-May. The phenology of seed germination is also a very valuable characteristic in identification. For example, silver maple samaras germinate as soon as they're released in late spring, whereas sugar maple, on the other hand, they don't mature until fall. So you can notice differences like that as well. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Lizzie to get us started on identifying specific oak species.
So we are now going to dive into a handful, but not a conclusive list of oaks that are common to Ohio. And we'll start by talking about features that you can look for in a tree just to identify it to genus Quercus for oak. So we want to remember that the Quercus genus is huge genus and very diverse, with over 500 different species across the globe. And so these characteristics are common, but they are not set in stone rules. Kind of the same thing for maples. Common characteristics, but not always set in stone. So with oaks, our leaves are often lobed, not always, but often, and alternately arranged. All oaks produce acorns. That is the one hard and fast rule, is that oak trees produce acorns, and that is what puts them into the genus Quercus. For most oaks, their bark is relatively thick, furrowed, and usually kind of inconspicuous. I like to think of it as like very typical bark that you would see on a tree. Nothing is really going to be eye-popping about it the way, you know, a birch tree might be. And another great clue for oak trees that I like to use if I really am not sure what I'm looking at is to look at the buds, because oak trees will have clustered buds. So many buds right at the tip of a branch, and not very many other trees do that. Their flowers are inconspicuous catkins pollinated by wind. And to talk about some of the phenology, oaks are pretty late to leaf out and pretty late to flower. So their flowers and leaves almost always emerge together. They are one of the last types of trees to leaf out. And then as we go into the fall and winter, we're not going to really see a whole lot of spectacular fall color from oaks. And we are going to see them displaying marcescence, hanging on to their dead leaves until either a strong wind knocks them off or their new growth begins to emerge. Oaks tend to be pretty big trees with a broad, round, open crown and large limbs. So particularly our open grown oak trees, some of our large street trees that are oaks in the city and in the surrounding suburbs have these massive crowns. In the forest, a large oak tree might not have these big crowns because they likely were growing in kind of a shady competition area. So similarities with maple trees, these are both wind pollinated. These trees both typically have lobed leaves, but not always, and they can occupy overlapping habitats. You can find them in the same types of forest. And then with such a large genus, we further divide oaks before we start splitting them into species, into two families, white oaks and red oaks. So with our white oaks, we are seeing leaves with rounded edges. The bark tends to be lighter, have a rougher texture. And the big difference is that acorns will ripen in one single season and will germinate as soon as they hit the ground. So acorns will germinate in fall once the seeds drop. We also will notice that the buds of white oaks tend to be pretty blunt. We can compare these to red oaks where our leaves have a sharp point. So whether the lobe of the leaf is sharp or on an unlobed leaf, there is a bristle at the tip. The bark tends to be a bit darker and have a smoother texture. And again, this really specific seed characteristic that red oak family acorns take 2 years to ripen and will germinate in the spring. And if we look at the buds, they tend to have a pointy tip. So common white oaks in Ohio, chestnut oak, bur oak, white oak, swamp white oak, and chinkapin oak. And some common red oaks in Ohio are scarlet oak, black oak, pin oak, shingle oak, and northern red oak. And then we'll leave you with another identifying feature that's really better for trivia or trivia than it is identification. But anytime an oak barrel is being used to cask wine, bourbon, or another type of liquor, it's always made of white oak wood. So this is because there are structures in the wood grain called tyloses that when the wood is dried, prevent the barrels from leaking. So red oak wood does not have this, and a barrel made out of red oak wood would not be waterproof. So whatever you were trying to cask would just leak right out, and you wouldn't be able to age it in that barrel. And so getting into the more specific species ID for these two families, we'll start with white oak. This is a pretty ubiquitous tree, both in the forest as well as in our urban planted landscape. The leaf is alternate and simple, about 4 to 7 inches long. The lobes are pretty reminiscent of fingers, typically a pretty deep cut lobe, and I find them to have a really regular and pleasing shape. The leaf is paler on the underside than it is on top, but not quite as distinct as we're going to see with swamp white oak. And we'll have a rounded top and kind of pointed base as that leaf tapers back onto the petiole. With our acorn, the cap is warty and bowl-shaped, and the cap is only going to cover about 1/4 of the acorn. So that's another important identifying feature of oak trees. How much of the nut does the cap cover? With white oaks, Quercus alba, it is not that much. These acorns, again, will mature in 1 growing season, fall off and then germinate. They tend to have a pretty long, narrow shape. With our white oaks too, we're going to see kind of ashy gray or lighter whitish bark. It's going to kind of range in texture from plated to scaly, but it's not going to have the regular furrows that our red oak, Quercus rubra, has. When these trees are open grown, they are immense, very, very large with really round, wide spreading crowns. If you're taking a walk in the forest, though, and you run into a white oak, it's going to be more upright, more oval, and not as wide. That's just because of the other trees around it that it's in competition with. So these are huge trees. They can reach up to 100 feet tall, several feet in trunk diameter. And then kind of going from big to small, looking at our twig, it will be red-brown, somewhat grayish, maybe even purple. It could look shiny because it doesn't have any hairs or tementum on the twig, and our clustered terminal buds will be reddish brown, pretty small with a rounded tip and no hairs. Then our swamp white oak, again, we're going to have an alternate simple leaf. The lobes on this leaf are going to be very shallow, so we saw in our white oak leaves how the lobe went almost all the way to the midrib, and on our swamp white, it's going to go in just a little bit. So I'm annotating on the screen. It's not really going in that far. The lobe tips will be rounded, but could look like they're coming to more of a point than the white oak leaves. So we can see, like on this lobe, that it's a little pointier, but it's still rounded. These leaves are going to be dark green and glossy on the top, and Glaucus and Tementum on the underside. So Glaucus meaning having a whitish cast, and Tementum meaning that when you rub this leaf between 2 fingers, you'll feel smooth on top and felty on the bottom. The acorns will occur usually in pairs on a pretty long stalk hanging down from the twig. That stalk is going to be anywhere from 1 to 4 inches long. And that cap is going to cover half of the nut. And it's also going to have a spiky texture. If we remember back to our slide talking about Tementum, that cap is also going to be, that cap and nut are going to have some little hairs on them. With our swamp white oak, it's not going to be as large of a tree as white oak, more irregular crown and more likely to have limbs lower down. The twig is light brown with, again, short, blunt buds. But what's different about these buds than white oak buds is that they'll have stipules. Stipule is like a stiff hair or thread that will be present around the terminal bud. So you can see it pretty well in this photo. Bark is dark gray, maybe scaly, but usually has some longer ridges than Quercus alba white oak. Now with bur oak, again, alternate simple leaves. These leaves can be hugely variable in size, so anywhere from 6 to 12 inches long. And they will have many lobes, and the lobes will also be very variable. So you can see how at the top of this leaf, the lobes are not really coming in that far. They're nowhere near halfway to the midrib, and down at the base, they're more than halfway to the midrib. So they're coming in pretty far. We're seeing those finger-like lobes like we saw in white oak kind of all over. I don't think a bur oak tree ever has two leaves that look the same. So if you're looking around and it's like, wow, this leaf doesn't look at all like this leaf on this twig, that can be a clue, where swamp white and white oak tend to have more kind of similarity from leaf to leaf. The top of the leaf, another mnemonic, can look a little bit like a crown. And these will be, again, slightly pale on the underside, but not as pale as swamp white oak. The acorns of the bur oak are very large. So these are the largest native acorns, and the cap covers at least half of the nut. And it might look like it covers more than half because there is a really long fringed margin to that cap. So they look pretty silly. With bur oak, again, I think of this as a pretty typical boring bark with vertical ridges. I think what we've accidentally covered up with our photo placement, and I'm sorry about that, is on young trees, the bark can look really corky. So you'll have these kind of obvious ridges sticking out from young twigs. That goes away as the tree ages. Our twigs will be stout yellow-brown, and again, we'll have the thread-like stipules like the swamp white oak. They'll also be a little bit fuzzy. Bur oak is another really massive tree, reaching up to heights of 100 feet with a long, clear trunk, so not as many lower down branches as our swamp white oak could have, and a really wide spreading crown. So we do see a lot of open grown bur oaks in more agricultural landscape, often the biggest tree in a field. These are trees that were planted to kind of mark a property line, and they're huge. So I notice them all the time driving on the interstates in Ohio and the Midwest. And next we have our Chinkapin Oak. So Chinkapin is a reference to the similarities that this leaf has with the true chestnut leaf. So chestnut trees were referred to as chinkapins, and noting the similarities between the two, Muhlenberg, the botanist for whom this tree is named, dubbed it the Chinkapin Oak. So again, alternate simple leaves, and we're going to have large, coarse teeth-like lobes on this leaf. So they're a little pointier than what we see on our swamp white oak, and not as deep as what we're seeing on our white oak and bur oak. These leaves will be dark, shiny green and paler below. With their acorn, it's going to be about ½ an inch to an inch long, and as you go down the nut, it'll swell towards the middle. The cap is only going to cover 1/3 of the nut at most, and the fringe will be tattered. So some acorns will have a really smooth cap, but you can see that this one is pretty tattered and irregular as you go down and around. The bark is going to look pretty thin and flaky, be very light gray. With our twig, it'll be orange brown, slender, again with clustered buds, and the scales on the bud will be prominent and look frosted. So I think you can see it in this photo, the tip of this scale, and I'll see if I can try to annotate it. So I'm looking like right here is kind of white and glossy. It's noticeably a different color than the rest of the bud, and that is unique to Chinkapin Oak. And we have our swamp chestnut oak, which the common name is going to tell you that it's going to look a lot like Chinkapin Oak. They both are named for their resemblance to chestnut trees. Again, it's going to look similar with the dark shiny green leaf and pale below. This is where your clues like how much of the cap is covering the nut. What does the stalk of the acorn look like? What does the bud look like? And this is where that will come in handy, because the leaves on these two trees look so similar. Your acorn is going to be pretty long, so 1 to 1.5 inches long and ripening to a brown color with a nut, a cap covering about 1/3 of the nut. Cap is pretty rough and scaly and has a short stalk to the twig, with ashy gray bark that is scaly and becoming more irregular and darker as the tree ages. So the twig could either be smooth or quite fuzzy. Could get kind of a variety of texture on that. It'll be orangish brown, and you're going to have a very long terminal bud relative to the size of the twig. What you're not going to have that the Chinkapin Oak had was that frosted scale. So the Chinkapin Oak went to white near this bud scale, and that's not going to be the case with Swamp Chestnut Oak. It'll stay kind of a uniform color. And so with this, I'm going to turn it over to Erica, and Erica is going to walk us through our red oak family.
Yes, so we will be starting with the northern red oak, or Quercus rubra. So this tree has leaves that are alternatively arranged and simple. They're 4 to 8 inches long, oblong shaped, and they typically have 7 to 11 bristle-tipped lobes, with sinuses that extend to about halfway to the midrib. So comparing this to white oaks, I like to think of like white oak leaves as the like bubble letters of trees, and red oak leaves as the like block letters of trees. So they're very blocky in shape, and they typically are uniform across the tree. And then as well, they're dull green above and slightly paler on the underside of the leaf. Their acorns are very round, usually about 1 inch long, sometimes slightly smaller than that. Their cap is very flat, not super rounded, and it's a very thick texture, but it covers only about 1/4 of the acorn, sometimes even less than that. And then contrary to our white oak acorns, they mature in 2 growing seasons, so they typically don't mature until late summer and fall. And then the bark of the red oak is ridged. The furrows kind of form a pattern that resembles ski tracks, usually like a reddish brown color, similar to the twig, which is also red-brown color and smooth texture. The clustered terminal buds are typically very large and conical shaped. I like to think of them, they kind of look like mini pine cones to me. And they're covered in, because they're covered in like a red-brown hairless scale. And some of those scales are kind of create like a frosty pubescence, so that would be our Tementum fine short hairs on the scales. And then lastly, our form. This is also a very large, statuous tree. It can reach up to 90 feet tall, similar to the white oak. When it grows in open growth, it has a very wide reaching round crown. However, when it grows in the forest, it has a long trunk with a round crown up towards the top of the forest canopy. And then we have our black oak. So black oak leaves have less lobes than red oak leaves. They typically have 5 bristle-tipped lobes, sometimes 7. And they have deeper sinuses than the red oak leaf. However, leaves that exist that are more shaded will have shallower sinuses and resemble a red oak leaf more closely. They're very, very shiny green above, as you can see in the picture. And then on the underside of the leaf, they have tomentum in the leaf armpits. So the leaf armpits being the little angle between the midrib and the veins coming out of the leaf. And you can see the Tementum in the picture. And then our black oak acorns are smaller than red oak acorns. They're very round. They're almost entirely enclosed in a bowl-shaped cap with very loosely attached scales that are very flaky, especially on the edges. And they're kind of the scales are light brown in color and very fuzzy. And then again, they mature in 2 years. The bark is a lot thicker than red oak bark. It's thick and rough, almost black and deeply furrowed. And then the inner bark is yellow, orange, and very bitter tasting. If you ever get the desire to try black oak bark, I don't know why you would. And then the twig is very stout and smooth. It's kind of a red-brown color, sometimes grayish-green. The buds are very large but slender, and they have like a light, almost whitish color, mostly due to the Tementum, which makes the bud very fuzzy. They kind of have a spear-like look to them. They're pointed and distinctly angular like a spear. This is also a large tree. It reaches up to 80 feet tall. It has a very irregular crown with a long trunk. That's wide at the base and tapers as it gets up towards the top of the crown. And then we have our pin oak, which has significantly smaller leaves than our other red oak leaves. They're only about 3 to 6 inches long. They have 5 to 9 bristle-tipped lobes. The sinuses in the lobes are very deep, and they extend nearly completely to the midrib, and they form kind of a U shape, which you can see on the leaf right there in the picture, with a bright light green color, slightly paler below. The acorns are also very characteristic. They're also the smallest of all the red oak acorns, and they kind of form stripes on the nut itself. The cap, however, is very flat and covers very little of the acorn, less than 1/4 of it. And it has red-brown scales on it. And then the twig of the pin oak is also very slender and red-brown in color. The terminal buds are small, slightly pointed, not nearly to the extent of the black oak, and chestnut brown in color. The form, they're also a larger tree, but not as large as our other red oaks. They'll reach to about 70 feet tall. And their shape is very characteristic. If you look at the tree, the lower branches grow at a downward angle. The middle branches will be growing horizontally, and the upper branches will be growing at an upward angle. And it also often looks kind of pyramidal in shape. And then we have our scarlet oak, which is also commonly confused with our northern red oak. The leaves are 3 to 7 inches long, so also smaller than the red oak leaves. They have deep sinuses, deeper than our red oak leaves, and they also create kind of like a U shape in the sinuses, but they have a little bit of a waist. So they're going to be narrow near the midrib, widen, and then narrow again towards the tip of the lobe. They also have tomentum in the leaf armpits. And in the fall, the scarlet oak has a very showy, brilliant red fall color that you do not see in other oak species typically. The acorns are also smaller. They're only about 1/2 inch to 1 inch long, and the cap covers over half of the nut. The scales on the cap are shiny and very taut to the cap, so they're not loose. And then one characteristic of Scarlet Oak acorns that other oaks do not have is they have concentric rings or fine cracks on the tip of the acorn, which you can see pretty obviously in the picture on the slide. And then our twig of the Scarlet Oak is pretty stout and thick, a red-brown color. Again, multiple terminal buds that are clustered. The Scarlet Oak buds are very plump looking, slightly pointed and angled, and they're covered with a light colored fuzz on the top half of each bud, which you can vaguely see in the picture. And then their form is also very characteristic. They reach up to 80 feet tall with an irregular crown, and they often grow with something called a butt swell, which is an expansion of the lower end of the tree trunk beyond the usual stump flare, root flare found in all like tree species. And you can see the butt swell in the picture on the slide as well. And then I believe our last common oak species is our Shingle Oak. So these leaves are one of the few oak species where it does not have lobed leaves, and it has an entire leaf margin, meaning the edge of the leaf is smooth. It has a single pointed bristled tip on the end. So even though it doesn't have lobes, it's still bristled tipped as red oaks are. It has a leathery type texture that's very shiny green at the top and pale and tomentous below the leaf. The acorns are very tiny, only half an inch big, and the cap covers about a third of the acorn, and the cap is very thin with light brown scales. The Shingle Oak twig is very slender with an olive green, orange, brown color. And the buds of this tree also slightly resemble pine cones, very conical in shape, pointed with red-brown scales. This tree is smaller compared to other oaks. It reaches up to 70 feet tall with a very pyramid to oval shape. Sometimes when it matures fully, it will take on more of a rounded crown, and its lower branches droop downward. Now I will hand it back to Lizzie to get us started on identifying maples.
Thanks, Erica. So we will jump in with maples, and we'll talk first about the genus characteristics that maples have. And again, these are rules, but there are exceptions to every rule. So we just want to keep that in mind. This is a diverse genus of trees, and what we list out here is mostly true for the majority of the species that we'll see, but it doesn't apply to 100% of maple species. For our leaf arrangement, this is going to be one of our best clues to start to narrow down the tree and get to identifying it to maple genus. Leaves are oppositely arranged, so that means leaves, branches, buds are all growing opposite each other. Flowers are small blossoms. They can be vibrant or relatively nondescript. That is species dependent, and they tend to flower pretty early in the spring. So red maple being one of the first to flower and other maples following suit, they will usually flower before they begin to set leaves. Fruit are seeds called samara grow in pairs of 2. And the angle at which these samaras are offset from each other, as well as the season where they mature, will tell you a lot about the species of the tree. Our leaves are mostly lobed and palmately symmetrical, so with veins emerging from a central radial point at the base of the leaf. We'll talk about phenology. Maples tend to bloom early and leaf out after bloom, so usually one of our first trees to leaf out, and the times at which maples set seed can vary by species. They do change color in the fall, usually early October, and they will drop their leaves after changing color. With size, class, and form, this is pretty variable depending on the species of tree, so we won't talk about a rule that you can kind of follow when you see the size or form of a tree to get it to maple, because it wouldn't be very helpful. Common species that you will find in Ohio, so most of these are native, but not all of them, are sugar maple, black maple, Norway maple, red maple, silver maple, box elder, and Japanese maple. With differences from our oak trees, flowers have petals and emerge before leaves. Leaves and buds are oppositely arranged with palmate leaf symmetry. They rarely grow to be as large as oak trees, and they have brilliant fall color and shed their leaves before winter. But we'll start with red maple, Acer rubrum. So this is a tree with simple opposite leaves and palmate venation. Red maple leaves have 3 to 5 lobes with a serrate margin. So you'll also notice that leaf margin is something that varies across maple species. The lobes and the sinuses of the lobes are relatively shallow. The leaves are about 2 to 4 inches long. They are green on the top side and tend to be paler on the underside. The samara grows in a pair, so you'll see 2, and they're at close to 90 degrees on that pair of samaras. They're on a stem that is 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch long, and the stem is often very red. The samaras will often also be red, although they may mature to brown before they fall off. So these appear in clusters before the leaves emerge, and they ripen in spring. So once the leaves are out, the red maple seeds are ripening. A lot of our red maples now are shedding their seeds, and this is an indicator for this species. The flower is vibrant but small, usually occurring in hanging clusters. So typically bright red, but sometimes structures of the flower can appear. Structures of the flower are yellow, and if those structures are large, then the flower can appear yellow. So these appear in early spring before the leaves. The twig is red with small lenticels. So lenticels are these kind of whitish bumps on the twig. The buds are usually pretty blunt, and they have several loose scales. So they grow out of a leaf scar that's V-shaped with 3 bundle scars. So you can see in this illustration, those 3 bundle scars illustrated pretty well. You can see them in the photo too, the little bumps on the leaf scar. On the bark, for younger trees, it's very smooth and very light gray. As the tree ages, the bark becomes darker and breaks into long, more finely scaled plates. These can be large trees. They can reach up to 90 feet tall. They tend to have a pretty round crown. We see a lot of variety in red maple trees because they're very common in the nursery industry. And so if you see a tree that's kind of hitting all these characteristics in the planted landscape, but the form looks off, that's because there are a lot of different varieties of red maple trees from the nursery where they have been bred and cultivated to take on a different form. So silver maples, this is a pretty ubiquitous tree in Ohio. And again, simple opposite palmate leaves. The difference between silver maple and red maple is that the leaf sinuses are very deep. So red maple has shallow sinuses, silver maple is very deep sinuses that give the leaf a lacy appearance. And there are very large teeth, so pretty coarse serration on the leaf margin. Our red maple had a more fine serration. They are called silver maples because they show a distinct color change between top of leaf and bottom. So you can see in this image, top of the leaf is dark, there's light, vibrant green. The bottom of the leaf is very pale and silvery on the underside. The seed is the largest samara of all of our native maple species. It has two wings that are greater than 90 degrees apart, how they hang. They can be up to 3 inches long, and they mature to be browns. They start green and then turn brown as they fall and age on the ground. As soon as they're released, they start to germinate and they mature in late spring. So once these mature in fall, you'll start to see silver maple seedlings. The silver maple flowers are green to red, and they grow in pretty dense clusters. And again, these appear really early in spring before leaves. So these flowers are monoecious, which means that there are both sexes on one tree. So male flower structures and female flower structures. A tree that is referred to as dioecious, there are male trees and female trees. I like to think of it as di, meaning two houses, so two different trees needed to create a viable seed. Monoecious, one house, you can create a viable seed with one tree. The twig of silver maple is chestnut brown, so less red than the red maple, and it also has lenticels. When you crush the twig, it's going to smell pretty unpleasant. And the buds are, again, reddish with large scales and V-shaped leaf scar. The bark of the silver maple is light gray and smooth when young, but it'll break up into long, thin strips that are pretty loose at the end. So really shaggy. If you can picture a large silver maple in your neighborhood, a lot of the ones that we have planted as yard trees are at the age where they're showing that really shaggy bark texture. So this is pretty similar to in color to red maple, but a much coarser texture. These are very large trees. They can reach over 100 feet in height with a round crown, usually have a pretty short trunk, so branches emerging pretty low down on the trunk. Silver maples often have a lot of hollows. They are a tree that when a limb falls, and they do fall, these trees tend to fail spectacularly in storms. Where that branch was will rot out and there will be a hollow. So these are great habitat trees. Owls love them, other cavity utilizing creatures love them. The branches tend to be long and have this structure where they kind of sweep down and then curve gracefully back up. And then we're going to talk now, we've gone over red and silver maples, about red silver hybrids. These are very common trees in our planted landscape, and they show characteristics of both red and silver maples. They have more lobes than red maples, and those lobes are not as deep as silver maples. So this is a photo of a tree that probably has more silver in its genetics than red, but you can have a wide range of number of lobes and kind of leaf shape. And they will show that silvery underside like silver maple does. These will typically be your brightest fall coloring maples, because that's what they were specifically bred in the nursery to do, is be very, very attractive in our planted landscape. They will produce seeds that will germinate as soon as they're released, like silver maples. They'll be about 2 inches long, so not quite as big as silver maple seeds can get, and they'll be greenish yellow with a touch of red, and again maturing pretty early in late spring. They will flower, although many varieties are sterile. Some do produce seeds and flower. The flowers will be green to red, and they'll appear long before leaves. The twig will be red-brown with lenticels. They'll have the large bud scales like both red and silver maples do, and a V-shaped leaf scar. The bark will look again like a cross between red and silver. So it'll break up into long, thin strips, but it won't be quite as shaggy as silver maple. And they will be about 70 feet in height. They can have a rounded crown, but often we'll see Armstrong maple, which is a red silver hybrid that has pretty tight branch angles. Red maple are notorious for having surface roots, so roots that kind of hang at the just at the edge of turf grass. People who mow their lawns and have a red maple tree will run over the roots all the time. I find that red silver hybrid maples tend to show that characteristic of red maples and tend to kind of grow in a growth habit more similar to red maples than silver maples. So they don't hollow as easily, they don't fail as easily, but they have those major surface roots. And at this point, Erica is going to walk us through the remaining maple species.
So then we have sugar maple. Obviously they are oppositely arranged and they are simple leaves. They're about 3 to 6 inches long, while being 3 to 5 inches wide. They have 5 rounded lobes with very pointed, steep teeth at the end. And unlike other maple varieties, they have a smooth leaf edge, so they're not as serrated as other maple leaves. Their samaras are also pretty characteristic as being a horseshoe shape, very much a steep VU wing. They're about 1 inch long and they appear in clusters and they turn brown when they mature in the fall. Their flowers are light yellow-green, very small and clustered, and they hang from a very long, slender, hairy stem. And then they appear slightly before the leaves in early spring again. The twigs are brown, very slender and shiny with very light, bright lenticels. Their terminal buds are brown, very sharp spear-shaped with tight scales. Their bark is very variable across tree to tree, as well as across their lifetime, as most trees are. But the bark is typically brown, with furrows, long, thick and irregular, often kind of papery looking as they curl outward from the trunk, with firm ridges. This is one of the larger maple species that grows up to 100 feet tall with a dense elliptical crown. And then we have our Norway maple, which is one of the largest leaves of the maples, usually 5 to 7 lobes with long pointed teeth and very shallow sinuses. So again, like we reviewed in the nomenclature section, they kind of resemble a London plane tree or sycamore leaf. They're dark green above and paler below, and when the petiole becomes detached, they will exude a milky white sap. And Norway maples are also very common to see it as the dark purple cultivar known as Crimson Kings. You'll see a lot of Norway maples that are a deep purple in terms of their leaf color. Their samara is also very characteristic, looking like a mustache. The wings are almost 180 degrees from each other. And they also have very flat seed cavities compared to other samaras. And then their flower are dioecious, meaning that it's either going to be a male flower or a female flower on the tree, not both. They're somewhat showy, kind of a nice light yellow color flower, and they appear in spring before the leaves. Their twigs are very stout, light brown with white lenticels. Their buds are very large and turban shaped, and they're first green before maturing to the purple red that you see in the image. The bark is gray-brown, shallowly furrowed with long, narrow, somewhat weaving interlaced ridges. They're not quite as large as other maple trees. They'll reach about 60 feet in height, and they have a very dense, rounded crown that's very predictable in growth, which is why you'll see it commonly planted in urban areas. And then we have the box elder, which is a pinnately compound leaf. So it has anywhere between 3 to 5 leaflets that are at 2 to 4 inches long. The edges of the leaflets are coarsely serrate and somewhat lobed. The leaflets often resemble a classic maple leaf, but not always. They're light green above and paler below. The samaras are very V-shaped, about 1 to 1.5 inches long, and they appear in drooping clusters. And in the fall, when they ripen, they're a light tan color that persists through the winter on the tree. Box elders are also dioecious, and their flowers are yellow-green in color that appear in spring. Their twigs are green to purplish green, moderately thick. They have a very characteristic leaf scar that meets in a raised point between the buds on each side of the stem. And the buds are white and hairy and rounded. The bark of box elder is very thin, slight shallow interlacing ridges, but overall the bark does look smooth, and it's a gray to light brown. This is also a medium-sized tree that reaches about 60 feet in height. It also often has very poor form with root suckers and multiple trunks. And then lastly, we have our ornamental maple, which is very commonly planted in gardens. It is not native to Ohio, but you see it everywhere here. It has opposite simple leaves that are smaller, only about 2 to 5 inches long, with a serrated margin. It has 5 to 7 lobes with very deep sinuses that I like to think resembles like a star shape. And then you'll often see this in a variety of colors depending on the cultivar, but it's most commonly seen in deep red. The samaras have about a 90-degree angle between the rings. They're reddish brown, and they mature in late summer and are persistent through the winter. The flowers are very inconspicuous and small, ranging from red to purple in hanging clusters, and they are also monoecious. And then the twigs are very slender, smooth. They can either be red or green, and the buds are very kind of chubby and conical. And another important thing to notice is the base of the bud is hidden by a tan fuzzy fringe, almost kind of like a baby blanket, a baby wrapped in a blanket. The bark is smooth and light gray. It also kind of has like a slight ridged pattern, but not deep at all. And this tree is very small, reaching 25 feet at its maximum, usually closer to like about 15 feet, with a round crown, and often being multi-stemmed, shrubby in appearance. And that concludes our oaks and maples tree ID. Just a quick reminder of some good places to practice your tree ID. Lakeview Cemetery is amazing. Holden Arboretum, the Botanical Garden. Anywhere in University Circle, Wade Oval is a great area to walk around. Any of the Cleveland Metro parks is great, but really just like walking around your neighborhood or just anywhere you can see a tree is a great place to practice your tree ID.
Thank you, Erica and Lizzie.
Thank you.
I know you took care of some questions that popped up, but do we have any additional questions from any of the people watching? And you can throw them in the chat or in the Q&A feature. And well, we're happy that you learned a lot. Thank you for tuning in this evening. I really like the piece on the red silver maple hybrid, Lizzie. Thank you. I don't think we're going to have any questions. Well, thank you, everybody. And have a nice evening.
Vic, to answer your question, how do you assess tree risk? It is, I think you could think of it as like a medical physical, basically, inspecting the tree and determine using kind of a natural history of the site as well as the tree and appearance of the tree to make a determination about the risk. So for example, if a branch falls off during a storm, that's often when people want to have their tree assessed for risk. Say, you know, this tree lost this major limb. I want to know if I should have it removed or if I can just have the limb cleaned up. And that is where a track certified arborist can go out and examine things like, was there soil shifting? What percentage of the canopy is dead? Are there any major dead branches? What type of tree is this? How long does this tree normally live? What sort of characteristics of this tree can make it more prone to limb failure or total tree failure? The most important thing about assessing risk is kind of determining the risk to what are referred to as targets. So target being people, cars, houses, sidewalks, and then thinking about and making an objective kind of qualification of the occupancy really of the target area. So knowing how far will a branch fall, what the shatter of the wood will be, and kind of what that occupancy rate of a target is. So, you know, if a house is there all the time, then that and that house is a target, then the occupancy rate is 100 or is constant. So it's really kind of taking into account the site considerations, the ongoing or new health conditions of the tree, and weather patterns, as well as things like species characteristics. So if you ever have a tree that loses a large limb during a storm, I would highly recommend having a risk assessment done if you're concerned about that tree. And often the arborist will tell you how frequently they think you should have that tree inspected. So they think, okay, this, you know, oak tree is doing really well. You probably don't need to have it inspected for another couple of years. Or if there is a major storm event, have it inspected then. So every tree is at risk of failing, either full tree or limb failure. The risk assessment is there to basically put an objective kind of description on what that failure could look like, and then allow the person who lives with the tree to decide what they're comfortable with.
Thank you, Lizzie. Well, I think that's it. We don't have any more questions. So, well, You're welcome, Vic. I guess that's a wrap, everyone. I guess there weren't any home runs down there next to the Caxton, were there?
Which is bad for the baseball team, but good for our presentation not being interrupted.
Right. Lizzie and Erica are in a building right next to the stadium, so there could have been the possibility of hearing some fireworks. Okay, you two. Well, I'm gonna stop recording here and end the webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye now.